Doing a black ant today. This is a requested pattern from a viewer who's just kind of getting into some of the wet flies and things, and ran across this in Ray Bergman's book and was just curious to see it in a video. This pattern is it's described in chapter 3 of his book. The recipe for this is on page 472, and it is on plate number 16. It's considered a dry fly in Ray Bergman's book, Trout. Anyway, it's a rather interesting pattern because of the way it was originally tied, and even the way that I'm going to do it. It's a fun pattern. There's different things you could do with this. I'm using a lacquer on top of that. You could color it a little bit different. The original was a black ant, and it has a black hackle with it, but if you want to, you could potentially use a grizzly hackle or even some other colored hackle if you want to tie the this ant pattern. So anyway, that is the black ant from Ray Bergman's Trout, and I'll get started. I've got my hook in the vise for the black ant. This is a Mustad 3906 in a size 10. A couple of things about that hook real quick. You can use the 3906 as a regular nymph hook. So it's going to be a little bit heavier than, say, a 94-840 R50, which is your typical dry fly hook, which is a little bit lighter. It's up to you which you use. Some people would rather use a little bit lighter. This fly in itself, the way it's tied, is going to sink. You could potentially tie this with a little something, some foam on the inside or something to try and make it float, in which case I'd go with a lighter wire hook. But this is a little bit heavier hook. You can even go with a heavier wire hook if you want the hook to help it sink a little bit more. So that's why I'm going with a little bit heavier hook, a regular nymph hook. The other thing is there's a couple of different ways that you can go about tying this fly. In the instructions in Ray Bergman's book on chapter 3 is where he talks about this fly. He also has the fly listed on page 472, the recipe, and it is on plate 16 if you want to take a look at it. But in his instructions, he talks about tying this in layers, and he talks about using silk. You have to keep in mind that back in the day when they were writing this up, they used silks to tie their flies. They didn't have synthetic threads that we have, nylons and polyesters and things like that. So it was a silk that they were using. It wasn't like a floss. You could potentially use a 4-strand rayon floss. The 4 strands are going to be a little bit much. It gets to be kind of bulky, but you could isolate 1 strand out if you want. I would just go with tying thread, which is what I'm going to tie this with. And you could go with a larger thread. I'm going to use a Danville 6/0 in black. You could use a 140 denier or even a 210 denier, something a little bit bigger. I find I have better control with the 6/0 black. Keep in mind, as I'm tying this, the original recipe was tied in layers. You would put on a little bit of thread to make your bumps. You would secure that. You would put some varnish, is what it calls in the book. I'm going to use some black lacquer, but you put your varnish on, you let that set up, and then you put it back in the vise and you reattach your thread. You build your bumps up a little bit more, some more varnish, then some more silk, some more varnish until you get it larger. The nice thing about that is it gives you a pretty solid body. Therefore, there's not much in there for buoyancy and it will sink. Now, I find the easiest way to do this, I'll start my thread just right behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to run it down to just about the end of, actually, I'm going to stop just past the point, because then I'll break away the tag, and then I'll continue on down to just about the end, not quite the end yet. At this point, I'm going to start to build the back half up, and then once I have that done, I'll move front and build up the front half. The idea is you want to basically have, in the end, when everything is said and done, you're going to have a ant body that looks like this. Just a round or oblong sections in the back and in the front, together in the middle. That's where we're going to palmer the hackle. So again, I find I get the best control by using just the 6/0 thread. Put a little wax on it if you want. It might help the thread from sliding around. I find that it still, because it's a smaller thread, it tends not to slide around much. And I'm going back and forth, and each time I do, I just go back and forth a little bit shorter so that I'm building this up. Keep in mind you want to be careful that you don't build it up too thick, because it's going to take at least 3 coats of lacquer on here to get the nice gloss body that we're looking for, and the lacquer itself is going to add bulk to the fly. So here we're going to get more or less the shape we're looking for. I'm going to stretch that out in the middle just a little bit, and then I'm going to let the lacquer do the rest. Now there's a couple of tricks here. If you're interested, a lot of times now when you start to bring your thread down forward, it's going to jump and slide down some of those thread wraps. If you want, take a little bit of super glue, a little Zap-A-Gap maybe, and just put just a little bit on the other side. Wrap that right around. Don't worry about that little drop, and just let that set. You can take any excess off there. Let that set up for a minute, and that will keep that thread from skipping down the other thread, and it'll help hold that together a little bit more. Another consideration is that if you're not going to use lacquer, you could put some epoxy on this. You could also put some UV resin on this. Both the epoxy, especially if you have a turner, and the UV resins, you can put on a little bit thicker. So you might even have less of a body. In other words, your back end and front end are going to be even a little sparser here, because you can thicken that up with the epoxy as well as with the UV resin. It's up to you. I'm going to show you in just a second with the lacquer. Each application of the lacquer, when it cures, or I should say dries, because that's what it really does. It dries, the solvent dries away. It's very thin, and that's why we have to build it up. So I'm making the body parts a little bit more pronounced, so that, because I'm not using an epoxy or a UV resin to actually build the body, I'm using some lacquer to more or less just coat it. So I'll get this one done and secured, and then I'll secure my thread. So I get my Zap-A-Gap on there just to help hold that and secure that in place. Bring my thread down in between the two. And you could do this actually up on that forward bump if you want. And I'm just going to put in a 3 or 4 turn whip finish to secure the thread. Now, like I said, the original recipe said to do this in layers. So you might, put a third of the thread on here and just start getting the shape. Stop, secure it, put a layer of varnish on it, and then proceed. I find it's just as easy to do it this way. So with the underbody all set up, I'm going to get my lacquer out, and I'm actually using a little disposable paintbrush to do this. You could use your bodkin like I've done on many wet flies, but it's a little bit quicker just by using this disposable paintbrush. I'm going to show you here. This is the first coat. I'm pretty generous with this. I can spread this around a little bit, but I'm not going to. It looks like I'm putting a whole lot on here, but I'm really coating it very well. And I'm putting a little bit extra on there to coat that because that is going to shrink back. And I'll show you in just a second. Careful not to get much of any lacquer down in that little valley between the two bodies. You don't want to fill that up. We want to make certain that when this is done, we have two clear, distinct segments. So there's my two sections all done. I find that when I do this, generally I have to sit here with this in here and rotate it a little bit. I've got a little bit more down under here, so I might bring that around just a little bit. There we go. When you first put it on there, it will flow to a certain extent, and you still can manipulate it, but the solvent flashes off on this fairly quick. So this is going to be firming up enough here just in a few more seconds that it's not going to drip. It's not going to start dripping to one side or anything. The other thing is, as you saw me with a bodkin, just touching that to kind of bring that excess that was on top down around the side a little. Right now, you can't do that because the top of this is all setting up. And if you do that, you're going to dimple it or you're going to pull some out, and it's not going to set up well. So that's the first coat of lacquer. And as I mentioned, it takes 3 coats for this because after each coat, it shrinks back. Now I'm going to show you here. This is what it looks like after that first coat. So as you can see some of the grooves of the thread in here. Hopefully that's in focus, but it is shrunk back considerably. This is what it looks like after 2 coats of lacquer. Better. Some spots are nice and smooth, but you can still see some of the thread wraps kind of poking through. And then this is what it looks like after the 3 coats of lacquer. And this is what we're looking for. We're just looking for a really nice, smooth body all around. Hopefully it's going to be fairly even shaped in the back and in the front. Doesn't have to be. You can also, I'm just pointing this out, the original recipe calls for all black. It's a black ant. 2 things that you can do with this. If you're using a lacquer, get a red lacquer or a yellow lacquer, or even a chartreuse lacquer. Do one side of the body in a different color, even though it's black thread underneath. It's going to help your visibility for this out there if you are going to try and fish this on the surface a little bit. For the most part, as I said, this is going to sink, especially with this heavier hook. So whether it's a different color or not, that would only be dictated on whether you think the fish would key in on it as a little bit different color. But it's something to play around with and have fun. So as I said, it is a black ant. It uses a black hackle. I'm just going to use this is a black rooster saddle. I'm going to take one that when I palmer it, I want the barbs to be at least the gap, if not maybe 1.5 times the gap. I'm only going to be putting a few wraps around on this, so it's not going to be real bushy, but I want it pronounced enough so that it will definitely look like legs. I'm going to trim some of these on the bottom here, and then I'm going to peel off some just above it where I trimmed. So I brought these barbs out, trimmed those as kind of an anchor, but I peeled those off. And the reason for that is that when I start to wrap that around, I won't have any barbs that are pointing back this way for that first half a wrap or so. They'll all come out nice and perpendicular. So I'm going to reattach my thread. And again, I'm just getting a few wraps to secure that. We don't want to build up a lot in there. I'm going to secure in that hackle. And then I will palmer this, should say collar this around, probably about 3, maybe 4 times. It just depends. We got 1, 2, 3, and I'm trying to bring each wrap right around in front of the other so that it helps to push those barbs backwards. Wrap that right on the underside. Again, bringing my thread kind of up on the body a little bit to let it, if I wrap it up here on the body and then it'll slide down over to those barbs, it'll trap those down, as opposed to me wrapping on top of them and then trapping them down on top of the body. If that makes sense. Trim away the excess. And I'll get another wrap or 2, not much. Again, I don't want to build that up. And then 4 or 5 turn whip finish. You get some of those barbs trapped in under there, poking out in odd directions. I don't think it's going to hurt the fly. Let's put it that way. Now, a little bit of head cement. And that's just going to go right down in there to soak down in those threads and kind of help protect all of that so it doesn't fall apart. That is the black ant. There's lots of black ant patterns out there now, or even ant patterns for that matter. But back in the day when this was first written about, it was fairly new. And I think it was just the process of putting in the layers and making this so that these body segments were so solid that it sank real well, I think was a kind of new and different. But a real popular trout fly, I have caught many trout on ant patterns. Not this particular one, but it is a good trout fly. I'm certain this would be an excellent panfish fly as well. So that is the black ant. Thanks for watching today. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help Dressed Irons, Please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.